Sarah Brennan climbed the switchback trail as dawn broke over the mountain, her worn calico dress catching on sagebrush with each weary step. 3 towns lay behind her, 3 rejections. In Alder, the sheriff's wife had called her "that woman" and closed the door. In Timber Creek, the boarding house keeper took one look at a widow traveling alone and turned her away. In Silver Bell, the preacher suggested she move on to somewhere more suitable. Her carpetbag grew heavier with each mile. Inside one change of clothes, her mother's cast iron skillet, and a recipe card she'd copied years ago at a church social. The card bore a name in careful script, Mary Ellen Stone. The trail crested. Below, a 2-story log house emerged from morning mist Stone Ranch. Smoke rose from the cookhouse chimney. 5 men moved between barns and corrals. Sarah straightened her threadbare sleeves and walked toward her last chance. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The ranch spread below her like a promise half kept. Sarah paused at the ridge, catching her breath, taking in what would either become her sanctuary or her final refusal. The main house stood solid 2 stories of chinked logs with a wide porch wrapping 3 sides. Smoke curled from 2 stone chimneys. Split-rail corrals held perhaps 24 horses, their coats gleaming in the early light. 3 barns in good repair. A bunkhouse with a stone foundation. A separate cookhouse with its own chimney. This was a working ranch, prosperous and well-maintained. A man with resources lived here. Workers emerged from the bunkhouse as she watched 5 men moving with the quiet efficiency of a long-established routine. One tall man in a leather vest directed the others toward the nearest barn. Another led horses to water. They moved like parts of a machine, each knowing his task without discussion. But something was wrong. Sarah's eyes swept the yard again, searching for what troubled her. Then she understood there was no laundry hanging on any line, no kitchen garden beside the cookhouse, though the soil looked rich enough, no curtains visible in the main house windows, no quilts airing on the porch rail, no chickens scratching in a coop. The ranch had everything a man needed to run cattle and horses. It had nothing that made a place a home. She'd seen this before her uncle's house after her aunt died. That same held-breath quality, as if the buildings themselves were waiting for permission to live again. Men could keep things standing, but without a woman's hand, a house became merely shelter, function without warmth. The cookhouse chimney smoked, but Sarah had passed close enough on her approach to catch the scent-scorched beans. Bitter coffee. Bachelor cooking. Survival food. Her heart lifted slightly. If they truly had a good cook, that chimney would smell of bread and bacon, not desperation. A tall figure stepped onto the main house porch, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, standing with the stillness of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He shaded his eyes, looking up the trail, looking at her. Jed Stone. It had to be. Sarah gripped her carpetbag tighter and started down the slope. The foreman at the barn had stopped working to watch. Another man emerged from the cookhouse, wiping his hands on a rag. She was expected, or at least noticed. Sarah walked steadily toward the porch, toward the silent man waiting there, toward her last chance at worth. Jed Stone was taller than she'd expected, and thinner, a gaunt, rangy man of perhaps 45 with dark hair threaded gray at the temples. He wore work clothes like his men canvas trousers, a shirt with rolled sleeves, boots worn smooth at the heel. But he carried himself differently. Authority sat on his shoulders like a familiar weight. His face could have been carved from the mountain behind him. Sarah stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She didn't climb uninvited, that would be presumption. The foreman had paused mid-stride on his way to the barn, watching. Another worker stood frozen by the corral fence. Even the horses seemed to sense the moment's importance. Their heads lifted, ears forward, the silence stretched like wire pulled taut. Sarah kept her voice steady. "Mr. Stone, sir, I'm Sarah Brennan. I've walked from Silver Bell." She paused, swallowed her pride, and spoke the truth she'd been trying to outrun. "I'm not worth much, sir, but I can cook." Jed Stone's expression didn't change, his eyes dark blue. She could see now looked at her without warmth or welcome, just assessment, as if she were a horse he might or might not buy. The silence grew unbearable. Somewhere behind her, a worker coughed. A horse stamped in the corral. "We gotta cook," Jed finally said. His voice was rough from disuse, like a gate that hadn't been opened in years. Sarah had passed close enough to the cookhouse to know this was a lie. The smell of burnt beans and bitter coffee didn't come from skilled hands. But she nodded, accepting the dismissal with what dignity remained to her. "I understand, sir." Her throat tightened, but she forced the next words out. "Might I rest an hour before I walk back? It's a long way to the valley." Another silence. Jed Stone looked at her carpet bag, at her worn dress, at her face. Something flickered in his eyes, not pity, but perhaps recognition. One exhausted soul seeing another. "Hank," he called without turning. "Show her the old cookhouse. 1 hour." Then he went inside, closing the door behind him with careful finality. The foreman was a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and sun-weathered skin. "Hank Millerson, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "Come on. I'll show you where you can rest." He led her across the yard toward a smaller log building set apart from the main cookhouse. Sarah noticed the workers had returned to their tasks, but their movements seemed distracted. The young one kept glancing her way. Hank opened the door to the old cookhouse. Dust motes swirled in the morning light, streaming through a single window. A washstand stood against one wall, its ceramic basin coated with grime. A dry sink with a pump handle occupied the corner. Cobwebs draped the exposed rafters. But the cast-iron stove looked functional, no rust. The firebox door hanging straight on its hinges. A stack of split wood sat in the box beside it. The pump, when Hank tested it, brought up clear water after a few creaking strokes, and hanging from the rafters, tied in bundles with twine, were dried herbs, wild sage, oregano, thyme. Their scent, faint but unmistakable, filled the dusty air. Sarah's breath caught. She knew these herbs. The recipe card in her carpet bag called for exactly this combination. Hank saw her looking up. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I'll level with you. The boss, he hasn't, since Mrs. Stone passed. He don't—" He trailed off, searching for words that wouldn't betray his employer. "How long?" Sarah asked quietly. 5 years, ma'am. 5 years. She looked around the abandoned cookhouse with new understanding. This had been someone's workspace, a woman's domain. 5 come October, Hank confirmed. He moved toward the door, then paused. "You need anything? Holler. I'll be in the barn." After he left, Sarah stood alone in the dust and memories. Mary Ellen Stone's dried herbs hanging overhead like ghosts. Sarah set her carpet bag on the dusty table and began a practical inventory. 1 hour wasn't much time, but if she could prove her worth. The root cellar door stood ajar beneath the floorboards. She descended 3 wooden steps into cool darkness. Bins lined the earthen walls, potatoes, their eyes just beginning to sprout. Carrots, woody but usable. A crock of salt pork packed in brine. Onions hanging in braided ropes, enough to make soup. Back upstairs, she found flour in a tin, salt in a ceramic crock, lard in a covered bowl. Someone had stocked these basics recently, probably for the current cook's use. But dust covered everything. This cookhouse hadn't seen regular use in years. Sarah built a fire in the stove, using kindling from the box and a few larger splits of pine. The draft drew well. She adjusted the damper, letting the flame settle to cooking temperature while she worked. She scrubbed the table first, using sand from a bucket by the door and water from the pump. The grime came away in gray streaks. Beneath, the pine planks showed golden, well worn from years of use. And there, near the center, someone had carved initials with a knife point, Messi plus J T S. Sarah's hands stilled. Mary Ellen Stone and Jed Thomas Stone. This table had witnessed their beginning, their love made permanent in wood. She was standing in a shrine. For a long moment, Sarah considered leaving, walking out now, sparing herself this intimacy with another woman's ghost. But the herbs overhead, the carved initials, the very dust spoke of love, and love deserved respect, not abandonment. She would cook with reverence. Sarah peeled potatoes, her knife moving with practiced efficiency. She diced the salt pork into small pieces, chopped onions fine, quartered the carrots. From her carpet bag she retrieved the recipe card, its edges soft with handling. The handwriting was elegant, careful. Stone Ranch soup wild sage at first bubble. Not before, not after. Jed says it matters. Me. Sarah's throat tightened. She was cooking a dead woman's recipe for a grieving man who'd just turned her away. The absurdity would have made her laugh if it didn't hurt so much. But she'd promised to prove herself. And perhaps, in some way, she could honor Mary Ellen Stone by doing this thing well. She fried the salt pork until it rendered fat, added onions until they softened, then potatoes and carrots with enough water to cover. The soup began its slow simmer. Sarah watched it carefully, one hand reaching up to crush dried sage between her palms. The first bubble broke the surface. She added the sage. The scent that rose was immediate and powerful, earthy, warm, faintly bitter. It mixed with potato and pork and onion into something that smelled like comfort, like safety, like home. Sarah stirred slowly, letting the flavors marry. Across the yard, in his office on the first floor of the main house, Jed Stone sat at his desk doing ledgers. Numbers marched in neat columns: hay purchased, cattle sold, wages paid. He used accounting like other men used whiskey to silence thought, to fill hours, to avoid the vast emptiness of a life reduced to mere function. His pencil scratched across paper. $73 for fence repair, $82 for new harness leather. Through the open window, a scent drifted. Jed's pencil stopped mid-figure. Wild sage. Potato. That specific combination Mary Ellen had perfected after a dozen attempts. The smell he'd lived with for 15 years and thought he'd never encounter again. His hand began to tremble. The ledger blurred. He gripped the desk edge, knuckles white, fighting the wave of memory. Mary Ellen at their old cookhouse stove, her dark hair escaping its pins, laughing as she adjusted seasonings. Jed, come taste this. Tell me if I've got it right. 5 years. 5 years of absence made tangible by scent. Boss. Hank appeared in the doorway, his expression careful. You smell that? Jed stood abruptly, his chair scraping. He walked to the window on unsteady legs. Across the yard, steam rose from the old cookhouse chimney, curling up into morning air. The woman, Sarah Brennan. She was cooking Mary Ellen's soup. Boss, Hank said again. Quieter now. Jed's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Bring her to the house. He paused. Tell her to bring the soup. Hank returned to the cookhouse, his hat in his hands. Ma'am, the boss wants to see you. He said to bring the soup. Sarah's stomach dropped. She'd overstepped, used supplies without permission, cooked uninvited in a space that clearly held painful memories. Of course he was angry. She wrapped the Dutch oven in kitchen towels, clean ones she'd found in a trunk, and carried it carefully across the yard. Workers had stopped to watch. The young one stood by the barn door, openly curious. The older man near the corral leaned on the fence rail, his weathered face unreadable. Hank led her up the porch steps and opened the front door. Inside, the main house was clean but cold. No curtains softened the windows, no quilts draped the furniture, no photographs on the mantel, no samplers on the walls. The house had been scrubbed of softness, reduced to bare function. Jed Stone stood beside a long pine table in what must have served as both dining room and gathering space. His face was composed now, The emotion she'd glimpsed from across the yard locked away again. "Set it there," he said, gesturing to the table head. Sarah placed the Dutch oven on a wooden trivet, removed the lid. Steam rose, carrying that scent of sage and potato, and something older memory made tangible. "Serve it," Jed said. She ladled soup into a tin bowl, placed it before him with a clean spoon she'd brought from the cookhouse. Then she stepped back to wait by the cold stove, hands folded at her waist. Jed stared at the bowl for a long moment. His jaw worked, muscles tightening beneath weathered skin. Finally, he lifted the spoon, brought it to his lips, tasted. His eyes closed. When he opened them again, they were wet. "How did you—" His voice broke. He tried again. "How did you know?" Sarah kept her tone gentle. "The recipe card in the cookhouse. Sir, it had her name, Mary Ellen Stone. I thought if I was going to cook, I should cook what belonged here." Jed set down the spoon with careful precision, as if sudden movement might shatter him. "You found her recipes?" "Just the one card, sir. For the soup, it said—" Sarah hesitated, then continued softly. "It said you told her the sage mattered. When to add it." "First bubble," Jed whispered. "Not before, not after." He pressed his palms flat against the table. "She must have made this soup 1,000 times. I never thought I'd taste it again." Silence filled the room like water rising. "Why are you running?" Jed asked suddenly, his eyes sharp now. "A woman alone, walking between towns. That's not normal travel." Sarah considered lying, inventing a story that painted her as respectable, worthy. But she was tired of pretense, and this man had just shown her his grief. He deserved truth in return. "I'm a widow, sir. My husband died of fever 2 years back in Missouri. We had no children, no property. I tried to make my way sewing, cleaning, cooking when I could find it. But in Alder, the sheriff's wife decided I was too friendly with the men at the boarding house. She started talk." Sarah's hands tightened on each other. "In Timber Creek, they'd heard the rumors. Said I must have done something to deserve being alone. That decent women didn't end up that way. In Silver Bell, the preacher suggested my husband's death was divine judgment, and I should move on before I brought misfortune to their town." Her voice stayed level, but her hands shook. "I just needed work. Mr. Stone, I just needed to be worth something to someone." Jed was silent for a long moment, his gaze steady on her face. "The valley talks," he said finally. 3 towns between here and Silver Bell, and every one of them knows everyone else's business. If I hire you, they'll talk about me too. They'll say things." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "I understand, sir. I'll walk back." She turned toward the door. "Wait." The single word stopped her mid-step. "You can cook?" Jed asked. "Yes, sir." "You can manage a household 5 men eat here daily. More during spring roundup and fall gather." "I can, sir." He stood, walked to the window overlooking the yard. His back was to her, rigid with something decision, perhaps, or fear. "I've let this place slip," he said quietly. "Since Mary Ellen, I've been—" He stopped, unable or unwilling to name what he'd been. "The workers need proper meals. The house needs someone who knows how to make it." He paused again. "The house needs someone." He turned to face her. "I'll pay fair wages, $20 a month plus room and board. You'll have the old cookhouse as quarters. Sundays off for church if you want it. I expect honest work, nothing less." Sarah could barely breathe. "You'll hear talk, Mr. Stone, about me, about us. The valley won't let this rest." "Let them talk," Jed said, and his voice carried steel now. "They talked about Mary Ellen too when she first came here. Said she was too educated for mountain life, too fragile for ranch work. They gave our marriage 6 months. A ghost of something not quite a smile touched his mouth. We had 15 years. Would have had more. He met Sarah's eyes. Point is, I learned then the valley doesn't get to decide what matters in my home. You're good at your work. This soup proves that. You've got dignity, even after they tried to strip it from you. That's all I need to know. You're hired. Sarah stood frozen, afraid to believe. Mr. Stone, Jed, he interrupted. If you're staying, call me Jed. Jed, she repeated, testing the name. Thank you. As she walked back across the yard, clutching the empty Dutch oven, Hank tipped his hat. Welcome to Stone Ranch, ma'am. The other workers nodded. One by one, the young one grinned outright, for the first time in 2 years. Sarah Brennan felt seen. For the first time in 5 years. Jed Stone felt the possibility of morning. Sarah woke before dawn in the old cookhouse, her first morning as an employed woman in 2 years. The rope bed beneath her creaked as she sat up. The corn-shuck mattress rustled like whispered secrets. Cold mountain air bit through the thin walls. She dressed quickly in the darkness, her second calico dress only marginally less worn than the first. No mirror hung on the walls, so she braided her hair by touch, tied it with a strip of cloth, and set about the work that would define her worth. The cast-iron stove required coaxing. She built the fire carefully, kindling first, then larger splits of pine, adjusting the damper until flames drew properly. While the stove heated, she worked the pump until water flowed clear and cold into the basin. She scrubbed her hands and face, the shock of mountain water driving away the last fog of sleep. Coffee first. She'd found a blue enamel pot in the cupboard, scoured it clean the night before. Now she measured grounds by eye, strong but not bitter, and set the pot on the hottest part of the stovetop. Biscuits next. Flour, lard, salt, a bit of baking powder she'd discovered in a tin. Her hands knew this work without thought, mixing until the dough felt right, rolling it out on the scrubbed table, cutting rounds with the mouth of a glass jar. The biscuits went into the oven. The coffee began to boil. Sarah sliced salt pork thin, fried it in the cast-iron skillet until crisp. The cookhouse filled with smells that spoke of care, of attention, of morning done right. At 6 o'clock precisely, boots sounded on the wooden steps outside. Hank entered first, removing his hat. Morning, ma'am. Behind him came the others. Tommy, young and gangly with red gold hair and a quick grin. Old Pete, weathered as the mountains themselves, moving with the careful stiffness of joints that had seen too many cold seasons. Miguel, dark-eyed and quiet, followed by his son Carlos, perhaps 16, trying to grow into his father's competence. They took seats at the long table without speaking, as if afraid conversation might shatter this fragile new thing, a woman's cooking, a woman's presence, the possibility of care. Sarah served them biscuits split and buttered, salt pork arranged on tin plates, coffee poured into tin cups that steamed in the cool air. She set a crock of wild honey in the table's center. She'd found it in the root cellar, likely harvested from mountain bees last summer. They ate in respectful silence. The scrape of knives on plates, the careful sips of hot coffee, the sound of men unused to plenty trying not to show desperation. Finally, Tommy spoke. Ma'am, these biscuits... He trailed off, searching for words that wouldn't offend. Sarah smiled. Tomorrow I'll try flapjacks, if that suits. Yes, ma'am, Tommy said, his grin widening. That'd suit just fine. Old Pete nodded agreement. Miguel murmured something in Spanish that sounded like blessing. They finished eating, thanked her quietly, and filed out to begin the day's work. After they left, Sarah stood at the door watching them scatter to their tasks, Hank toward the horse barn, Tommy and Carlos to the cattle pens, Old Pete and Miguel to mend fence in the near pasture. Boots on wood made her turn. Jed stood in the cookhouse doorway, hesitant as a man entering a church where he wasn't sure of his welcome. He didn't sit, didn't ask permission, just moved to the stove and poured coffee into a tin cup with his own hands. He stood there, cup warming his palms, looking at nothing in particular. Good, he said finally, though he hadn't eaten. Then he was gone, walking back toward the main house with his coffee, his shoulders carrying their familiar burden of solitude. Small, Sarah thought. But it was acknowledgement. It was enough for now. After cleaning the breakfast dishes, Sarah walked to the main house. Jed had given permission yesterday, light housekeeping, if you're inclined, and she was very much inclined. A house this neglected held stories, and Sarah had learned that understanding the past helped navigate the present. The front door stood unlocked. Inside, morning light slanted through bare windows onto furniture that seemed to huddle in its own abandonment. She started with the parlor-swept floors, dusted surfaces, opened windows to let mountain air chase out the staleness of grief. In a corner, a large trunk sat against the wall. Sarah hesitated, then lifted the lid. A quilt lay folded on top, half-finished, the needle still thrust through fabric where someone had stopped mid-stitch. Log cabin pattern, the traditional design of strips arranged around a central red square. Home and hearth. Mary Ellen had been making this when she died. Beneath the quilt, wrapped in muslin, a woman's Bible, its leather cover worn soft. Sarah opened it carefully. Pressed flowers fell from between pages, mountain wildflowers. Their colors faded, but their shapes preserved. Columbine, Indian paintbrush, wild rose. Someone had marked passages about love, about faith, about enduring. At the bottom of the trunk, a tintype in an oval frame. Sarah lifted it into the light. Jed and Mary Ellen on their wedding day. He looked impossibly young, maybe 25, his face open and smiling. Not the ghost of a smile she'd seen yesterday, but full joy. His arm circled Mary Ellen's waist with casual possession. She leaned into him, her dark hair crowned with flowers, her face radiant with certainty. Sarah stared at that young Jed, trying to reconcile him with the gaunt, silent man who'd hired her. Grief had carved away everything soft, leaving only the framework. She almost didn't recognize him. She carried the tintype and Bible to Jed's office, a small room off the main hall, dominated by a desk covered in ledgers and bills. She placed both items in the center of his workspace, where he couldn't miss them. Then she returned to cleaning, working her way through rooms that smelled of dust and abandonment, until the afternoon light began to fail. That evening, as she walked back to the cookhouse after serving supper to the workers, she heard a sound from Jed's office window, left open to the cooling air, crying, raw and unrestrained, the sound of a man who thought himself alone. Sarah stopped on the path, her hand pressed to her chest. Every instinct screamed to go to him, to offer comfort. But she understood grief. Some tears needed privacy. Some pain had to be witnessed only by God and darkness. She walked on to the cookhouse, leaving him his sorrow, after full dark. Sarah sat on the wooden steps outside her door, watching stars emerge over the mountain peaks. The evening was cool, but not yet cold, that particular mountain-autumn balance before winter's serious arrival. Boots scuffed gravel. Hank appeared from the direction of the barn, a respectful distance away. "Evening, ma'am. Mind if I sit?" "Please." He settled on the bottom step, maintaining propriety. They sat in companionable silence, watching the last light drain from the western sky. "You're good for this place," Hank said finally. "Haven't seen the boss, present, in years. Today, he spoke at breakfast meeting, gave actual instructions instead of just grunting. Small thing, maybe, but it matters." "He loved her deeply," Sarah said quietly. "Fever took her fast." Hank replied, 3 days from first chill to the end. Boss wouldn't leave her side. We had to bring him food, water. He held her hand the whole time. His voice roughened. When she passed, something in him just stopped, like a clock when the spring breaks. Still ticking, still keeping time, but the chime don't ring anymore. Sarah understood that perfectly. Grief like that, it's not weakness. It's the price of great love. Most people never love deeply enough to grieve that hard. Hank nodded. Valley don't see it that way. They say he should have remarried, moved on, stopped mourning. When he didn't, they decided he was strange, unnatural. Then you show up, and he trailed off. And they'll say worse, Sarah finished. About both of us. Let them, Hank said with surprising heat. You belong here, ma'am. Don't let their talk convince you otherwise. Sarah's throat tightened. It was the first time in 2 years anyone had said those words to her. You belong. Thank you, Hank. He stood, settled his hat. Sleep well, ma'am. Morning comes early on a ranch. After he left, Sarah remained on the steps, wrapped in the mountain night, believing for the first time that perhaps, just perhaps, she'd found her way home. Saturday morning arrived with the weight of necessity. The ranch needed supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, salt. Hank would make the run to Silverbell, and Sarah, however much she dreaded it, needed to go with him. A household manager should know her stores, should build relationships with merchants, should be visible, should face what she'd been running from. They left at dawn, the buckboard wagon rattling down the mountain road. Hank drove, Sarah beside him on the wooden bench seat, a rope-handled basket on her lap for carrying smaller purchases. The morning was clear and cold, frost still white in the shadowed places. You don't have to come, ma'am, Hank said as they descended toward the valley. I can handle the buying. I need to learn the merchants, Sarah replied, though her hands gripped the basket handle too tightly. And I can't hide forever. Hank nodded approval but said nothing more. Silverbell on Saturday morning bustled with weekly commerce. Farm wives in wagons, ranch hands on horseback, miners from the hills spending wages on supplies and whiskey. Hank guided their wagon to a halt outside Gunderson's Mercantile, the largest general store in town. Sarah climbed down, smoothed her calico dress, and followed Hank inside. The Mercantile smelled of leather and coffee and pickle brine. Glass jars lined shelves behind the counter, filled with penny candy and buttons and small luxuries. Bolts of fabric leaned in a corner, calico and muslin, and one precious bolt of silk. Cracker barrels stood open, their contents available for sampling. Tools hung from ceiling hooks. The store held everything a person might need, if they had money and were welcome. Mrs. Gunderson stood behind the counter, her substantial frame draped in a crisp brown dress, her gray hair pulled into a severe bun. Her smile of greeting froze when she saw Sarah. Mrs. Brennan. The name came out flat, drained of warmth. I heard you'd found employment. The pause before employment carried a freight of judgment. Other women in the store stopped their browsing. Sarah felt their stares like brands against her back. Mrs. Cooper from the boarding house, Miss Jameson who ran the millinery, 3 farm wives whose names Sarah didn't know but whose expressions spoke universal condemnation. Sarah kept her voice level. Yes, ma'am, at Stone Ranch. How fortunate. Mrs. Gunderson's eyes swept Sarah from head to toe, cataloging worn fabric, frayed cuffs, the signs of poverty barely held at bay. And Mr. Stone, he's aware of your situation. Sarah lifted her chin slightly. He hired me to cook, ma'am. That's my situation. A titter ran through the watching women. Mrs. Cooper whispered something behind her hand to Miss Jameson. Both smiled with the cruel satisfaction of those whose suspicions have been confirmed. Of course, Mrs. Gunderson said, her tone suggesting she believed nothing of the kind. What can I get for you? Sarah read from the list she'd prepared. 50 pounds of flour, 20 of sugar, 10 pounds of coffee beans, 30 of dried beans, 5 of salt, 2 of baking powder, 1 tin of lard. Mrs. Gunderson's eyebrows rose. Quite a lot of supplies for one woman. For a ranch household, ma'am, 5 men, plus Mr. Stone. Ah, yes, 5 men. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Hank stepped forward, his voice carefully polite but carrying an edge. Mrs. Gunderson, if you'd be so kind as to fill the order. We've got a long drive back. The storekeeper began gathering supplies with unnecessary slowness, making them wait while she served other customers first. Sarah stood by the counter, hands folded, refusing to show discomfort. She could feel the stares, hear the whispers. Alone with all those men. No better than she should be. Poor Mr. Stone, taken advantage of in his grief. Finally, the supplies were assembled. Hank paid from the ranch account. Mrs. Gunderson marked it in her ledger with obvious reluctance and loaded the heavy sacks into the wagon. Sarah carried the smaller items in her basket: the salt, the baking powder, a small sack of dried apples Hank had added without asking. Outside, Sarah climbed onto the bench seat. Her hands shook so badly the basket rattled. Hank clicked to the horses, guiding them out of town before he spoke. "You did fine, ma'am." "They think I'm his mistress," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They thought that before you ever arrived." Hank replied grimly. "Valley needs someone to judge. Makes them feel righteous, I guess. Boss knew it would happen. That's why he asked if you could stand the talk." Sarah stared at the road ahead, watching the mountain grow closer. "I don't know how long I can stand it." "Longer than you think," Hank said, "especially with the boss standing beside you." Sunday afternoon brought an unwelcome visitor. Sarah was in the cookhouse preparing a stew for supper when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. She moved to the window. A man on a black gelding wearing the dark suit and white collar of clergy dismounted at the main house. Reverend Hammond. She recognized him from Silver Bell, though they'd never been formally introduced. He'd been the one to suggest she move on when she'd asked about work in his church. Jed emerged from the barn where he'd been checking on a mare with a stone bruise. He wiped his hands on a rag, his face carefully neutral. Sarah couldn't hear their words from the cookhouse, but she could see. Jed gestured toward the porch, not an invitation inside, just a place to stand and talk. The Reverend climbed the steps. Jed remained at the bottom, forcing Hammond to look down at him. The Reverend spoke at length, hands moving in emphasis. Jed's posture grew increasingly rigid. Sarah's heart hammered. This was about her. This was the valley coming to take away what she'd just found. She moved closer to the window, straining to hear. "People are concerned." The Reverend's voice carried on the mountain wind. "There's always talk." Jed's reply was too quiet to hear fully, but his tone was ice. "Her reputation." Hammond gestured toward the cookhouse. Jed's voice rose now, clear and sharp. "She has no reputation. She has gossip, which started before she ever arrived here." The Reverend spoke again, his tone conciliatory, attempting reason. Jed cut him off. "If the valley has nothing better to do than invent sin where there's only honest work, that speaks poorly of the valley, not of Mrs. Brennan." Hammond stiffened. Tried again. "Reverend." Jed's voice carried absolute finality. "You came here uninvited to spread rumors dressed as concern. I'm asking you to leave. Good day." He turned and walked toward the barn, not waiting for response, not giving Hammond the courtesy of watching him leave. The Reverend stood on the porch a moment longer, his face flushed with embarrassment or anger, Sarah couldn't tell which. Then he descended, mounted his horse, and rode back down the mountain road. Sarah stood at the cookhouse window, tears streaming down her face. Not tears of shame, tears of being defended. After supper, Jed ate with the workers for the first time. Though he spoke little, Sarah cleaned the dishes and put the cookhouse to rights. She was hanging the dish rag to dry when boots sounded on the wooden steps. Jed stood in the doorway, hat in hands. In the 2 weeks she'd been at Stone Ranch, he'd never come to the cookhouse. Always. She'd gone to him to the main house, to deliver meals, to ask questions about supplies or household needs. This crossing of the threshold meant something. "May I speak with you?" he asked. "Of course. Please, sit." He entered awkwardly, too large for the small space, and sat at the table where she'd served breakfast that morning. He turned his hat in his hands, around and around, the brim wearing a track in his palms. "What the Reverend said today," he began. Sarah interrupted gently. "You don't owe me explanations." "Mr. Stone, Jed," he corrected. "And I do. I know what they're saying in the valley, that it's not right. It's kind of you to say so, but I've heard worse." He looked up at that, meeting her eyes directly. "Mary Ellen, when she first came here, they talked about her too. Said she was too educated for mountain life. A school teacher from Denver. Thinks she's better than us. Said she was too fragile, wouldn't last one winter. They gave our marriage 6 months." A smile touched his mouth, the first real smile Sarah had seen, brief as morning frost. "We had 15 years. Would have had more if—" He stopped, the smile fading. "Point is, I learned then the valley doesn't get to decide what matters in my home. You're good at your work. You've brought life back to this place. That's all that matters." Sarah's throat tightened. "Thank you for standing up for me today." "Thank you," Jed said quietly, "for teaching me I still can." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "They'll keep talking. Might get worse before it gets better. But I won't turn you out because they can't mind their own business. You have my word on that." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the lamplight, holding his words like a promise. "You have my word." In the 2 years since her husband died, no one had given her their word. No one had stood between her and judgment. No one had chosen her worth over social comfort. Jed Stone, in his grief and brokenness, had done all three, and Sarah Brennan, in her gratitude and growing understanding, began to realize that healing never happened alone. It required two people choosing again and again to stand together against the wind. Mid-October brought the first serious threat of winter. Sarah woke to a different quality of cold, the kind that pressed against walls and found every crack, every gap in the chinked logs. The sky through her window looked like hammered iron. Old Pete noticed it at breakfast. "Storm coming," he said between bites of flapjacks. "Big one, feels like maybe 3 days' worth." Jed nodded agreement. "We'll move the cattle to lower pasture today. Hank, take Tommy and Carlos. Miguel, check the roof on the horse barn. I heard some shingles loose last week. Sarah." He paused, unused to giving her direct instruction. "You might want to prepare. Stock extra wood. Water. Pete's right about 3 days." After the men left, Sarah surveyed her domain with new urgency. The woodpile outside the cookhouse held perhaps a day's worth of fuel. She spent the morning hauling split logs from the main supply shed, stacking them against the cookhouse wall under the eave where they'd stay dry. Her back ached. Her hands blistered, but she kept working. The root cellar needed checking. She descended into its cool darkness, counting stores by lamplight: potatoes, carrots, onions, the salt pork crock. Enough for a week if she stretched it. Dried beans in abundance. Flour, cornmeal, lard. They wouldn't starve. She filled every pot, every bucket, every vessel she could find with water from the pump. If the pump froze, they'd need reserves. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped sharply. Wind picked up, coming down off the peaks with a sound like distant locomotives. The iron sky descended, pressing close. Jed returned from moving cattle as the first snow began, not the gentle flakes of early season, but hard pellets that stung exposed skin. He stopped at the cookhouse door, his face reddened by wind. "You stocked up?" he asked. "Yes. Wood, water, food, we're ready." He nodded, started to leave, then turned back. "Storm could be bad. You need anything from the main house: blankets, lamp oil, anything, you come get it. Don't wait." "I'm fine. You stocked me well when I arrived." A moment of connection passed between them across the threshold. Two people who understood preparation as survival, who knew that mountain weather granted no second chances. Then he was gone, and the snow began in earnest. The blizzard arrived in full fury after dark. Wind screamed around corners. finding every weakness in the cookhouse walls. Snow didn't fall so much as drive horizontally, piling against the door in drifts that Sarah had to shovel clear every few hours. The world outside the windows disappeared into white chaos. She kept the stove burning hot, feeding it steadily, banking coals at night to hold warmth through the darkest hours. The cookhouse became an island of heat and light in a sea of frozen violence. The first day, the men came for meals but returned quickly to the bunkhouse. The second day, they came for breakfast and stayed longer, huddled near the stove with tin cups of coffee, reluctant to face the journey back across the buried yard. By the third day, they simply stayed. "Bunkhouse stove ain't keeping up," Hank admitted as they all crowded into the cookhouse for the midday meal. "Chimney must be partly blocked. We're burning through wood but can't get warm." Sarah made soup. Of course she made soup. That recipe she knew by heart now, and set out biscuits, the last of the butter, strong coffee that could wake the dead. The men ate gratefully, their faces red from cold, their boots leaving puddles of melted snow on the plank floor. Jed arrived for supper on the third day, snow caked in his beard like frost, his coat white with accumulated ice. He stamped his feet at the door, knocked off what snow he could, and entered. The cookhouse was crowded now, 6 men in a space meant for one woman's work. But no one seemed to mind. They made room at the table, passing bowls and plates, creating community through necessity. Tommy asked about Sarah's life before the ranch, careful questions, respectfully phrased. She found herself talking about her husband, a gentle man, a bookkeeper in a dry goods store in Missouri, how they'd met at a church social, how they'd wanted children but none came. "And after he passed?" Miguel asked quietly. Sarah's voice dropped. "After, I learned that a woman alone is either pitied or suspected. There's no middle ground. People don't know what to do with a widow without family, without means. So they decide she must be somehow at fault, must have driven her husband to an early grave through nagging, or must be looking to trap another man, or must be loose in her morals. Easier to judge than to help." Old Pete grunted. "Valley is hard." "People are hard when they're afraid," Sarah said. "And a woman who doesn't fit their understanding of how things should be that frightens them." Jed, who'd been silent through the meal, looked up at that. His eyes met Sarah's across the table. Some understanding passed between them, wordless but complete. They were both refugees from others' fear, both punished for failing to perform grief or survival in the expected manner. The storm broke on the fourth morning. Sarah woke to silence the sudden, shocking absence of wind. She pushed open the cookhouse door onto a transformed world, everything buried, softened, made new under 3 feet of pristine snow. The sky had cleared to crystalline blue. Sunlight on fresh snow created a brilliance that hurt the eyes. The men emerged from the bunkhouse like bears from hibernation, squinting in the snow-bright morning. They began the work of digging out paths to the barns, to the main house, to the well. The sound of shovels scraping wood, of men calling to each other, filled the mountain air. Jed appeared at the cookhouse carrying an armload of split firewood, his breath steaming in the cold. "Thought you might need," he began. Sarah was standing in the doorway, staring at the white world, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. She turned at his voice. "Why did you really hire me?" she asked. He stopped, lowered the wood slowly, stacked it by the door. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then, "The soup. It smelled like home. Like—" He searched for words. "Like being alive, felt. Once." He sat on the cookhouse steps, heedless of the snow. Sarah sat beside him, their breath mingling in clouds. "I've been just existing," Jed continued, his voice rough. 5 years of existing, going through motions, running the ranch because I didn't know what else to do. The house got emptier. The food got worse. I didn't care about anything except making it to nightfall so I could sleep and not think." He turned to look at her. "When I smelled that soup, when I tasted it for the first time since Mary Ellen died, I remembered what it felt like to want to wake up in the morning, to have a reason for the day besides habit. His voice broke slightly. You gave that back. Made me remember there's more than grief, that that I wasn't completely dead inside. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. You gave me worth back. You hired me when everyone else saw trash to be swept away. You stood up for me against the Reverend, against the valley. You made me remember I'm more than what they say about me. They sat in the snowblind light, two broken people recognizing each other's fractures and the healing that had begun. Quietly, in shared meals and defended dignity, and the simple act of standing together. I don't know what happens next, Jed said finally. The valley won't stop talking. Might get worse. But I know I don't want to go back to existing. Don't want this house to be a tomb again. I don't want to run anymore, Sarah replied. Don't want to keep measuring my worth by others' judgments. Jed stood, offered his hand to help her up. She took it. They stood between the cookhouse and main house, between storm and sun, between what was broken and what might still be built. Whatever comes, Jed said, we face it together. You have my word. Together, Sarah agreed. The word hung between them like a promise, like morning light on new snow, like the first breath after years of holding still. Around them, the ranch returned to life, men calling to each other, horses whinnying in the barn, the sound of shovels clearing paths through drifts. Stone Ranch, buried and resurrected, ready for whatever winter would bring. And in the cookhouse window, a lamp-burned beacon and invitation, symbol of warmth in the cold, proof that even frozen things could thaw when tended with care. The letter arrived 2 weeks after the storm from Reverend Hammond, but different in tone. The county investigation had been quietly dropped. Several church families wished to extend invitations to Sunday dinner. Mrs. Gunderson's mercantile would be pleased to serve Stone Ranch without judgment. Sarah read it in the main house parlor, where curtains now hung and Mary Ellen's quilts draped the furniture. Jed stood beside her, reading over her shoulder. They're trying, he said quietly, because you stood up when it mattered. Sarah replied, because your workers testified, because we didn't run. That evening, the household gathered for supper in the main house, a new tradition Sarah had started. Workers, Sarah and Jed around one table, passing bowls and sharing the day's stories. Family built not from blood, but from choice and shared courage. Jed raised his tin cup, to second chances, to standing together, to home. To home, they echoed. Sarah looked around the table at faces that had become dear men who'd defended her, a man who'd chosen her worth over comfort, a community slowly learning that grace mattered more than gossip. Sometimes healing required only one person brave enough to say, you belong here. Have you ever been wrongly judged? Like Sarah, simply for circumstances beyond your control. How did you find your way through?